but his work takes him all over the world. He does amazing art and architecture and graphic design, and just the whole gamut of all kind of creative things. He shows his work all over. He's recently been to the Venice Biennale. So here is Mr. Philip Beesley.
I'm tremendously happy to be here. Thank you very, very much for allowing me to come and join with you. Let me admit my fear. Not just one fear, actually, just so many fears, but it's the pronunciation. No, you just said PechaKucha. I mean, I was so prepared to say PechaKucha, you know? Is that so bad? Can we go with that? What's wrong? I mean, like Canadians are kind of self-conscious about how they speak. Because they say things like time and so on. It makes me feel separate from that. But if I know that you also have just a slight hesitation in saying also, then maybe there's some kind of common bond between us. I'm going to share a project tonight. I'm going to focus on the Hylozoic Ground project, which is currently up in Venice, as a series of speculations about possible future architectures. And this kind of work, which is collaborative work, is asking some very simple questions. It's asking, can an environment be something which is sensitive? Might it be possible to make living things? Might the things that we make know us? Might they care? Might we have a kind of renewed relationship? So Hylozoic ground, Hylozoic is a lovely word from ancient Greek, which means life out of material. I had earnest conversations with my friends when I was 6 about whether rocks were alive. You did as well. But it's a tremendously optimistic word about working from concrete existence into things and creating vitality. So the kind of immersive environments that you see here, which are trying to breathe and increasingly live through invested metabolisms and distributed computation and invested intelligences, are pursuing this sense of an increased sensitivity in the environment. And in parallel with that kind of work is near market work, such as the North House. This has a responsive envelope which harvested energy and oriented itself to the sun. It was mounted on the Solar League Decathlon last year in Washington. It did pretty well. It competed and went and placed 4th overall. So there are some aspects of this work which are deliberately innovative in working towards market. But tonight I'm going to show you some more of the speculations involving deliberately delicate, moving, breathing environments which try to work right at the edge of perception, slowly trickling and moving and flexing with us, right at the edges of our perception, quite differently than the way robots work or the way science fair exhibits work, where we push a button and want them to behave and work at our service. Rather pursuing a kind of mutual, very gentle, subliminal experience with the environment. Let me show you some of the basic principles that invest this environment by speaking about a definition of architecture first. When I think about architecture, I think about standing on the surface of the earth. I think about this extraordinary sky and mountainscape and desert that underlies your own community, and perhaps having some common ground with the glacier-scoured magma, the granite, and that's my own Canadian shield. And I think about a simple definition of architecture as being an enclosing filter around that kind of state of standing on the earth, investing a series of octaves of multiple resonant nodes that might expand our experience and bring the environment in. A kind of very practical project of generating sensitive filters as a definition of architecture. Now there's some practical foundations for that kind of ambition, such as this wonderful slide by Donna Lingber, a colleague, a cancer researcher, who taught me that the interior of a cell was not just pure vague liquid, but was a delicate tensegrity network made of myosin and actin proteins making a kind of geodesic framework which you could address fluids, where you could participate very directly in subtle mediums. And that encourages me to think about the space around each body as a subtle thermal siphon of multiple energy gradients, where we can increasingly work with liquid and arid spaces as directly a design space for architecture. An early project which tried to work with this was this geotextile, a very simple twig blanket that coated the North Atlantic coast and served as a sheltering kind of layer for new growth to take form over many years, gently subsiding and allowing turf to take over. Those kind of ideas went into more active filters, such as this hovering veil, a kind of a static hovering lung which works through osmosis in an installation in London a few years ago. This uses multiple tiny little pores which pull air and trickling convections through it. That moved into increasingly active systems, such as this robotic geotextile, endothelium, which is powered by tiny little lemon batteries, that is acids with copper and aluminum electrodes generating 5 milliamps per cell chained together into series, and then generating a very slow movement of trickling and grabbing into the earth. Those kind of active systems have increasingly been drawn together into a synthetic work in which structural meshworks, new metabolisms, mechanisms, distributed intelligence are all working together into making a more comprehensive environment. Here you can see one of the recent installations in this series, in which a series of hovering filters gently trickle air through them, and then there's also a wet chemistry system, a kind of a new metabolism akin to a lymphatic system, which harvests material, generates and generates harmless limestone deposits out of carbon. The kind of work starts with very practical steps of weaving and making flexible frameworks, hyperbolic meshworks using digital fabrication. And this kind of canopy and column system, which is a practical structural system which is being developed, is then increasingly clothed with lightweight filters that expand the ambit of these structures in order to make them shelters and filters, active filters, which modify the environment. Laying on top of those filters tends to be layers and layers of ladders and glands and traps, some of which are invested with salts which have a hygroscopic function, which pull fluids into themselves and start to charge up the environment with a kind of viscous, humid atmosphere, which sets up a fertile layer, which starts to make an architectural envelope function akin to a turf or a living wall. Along with those physical functions, the environments are invested with a certain intelligence of arrays of microprocessors and sensors, such as the proximity sensor that you see working here, which senses your movement and touch, and then allows shape memory alloy driven mechanisms to touch back and to push back, sometimes in gentle nurturing motions, other times in repulsive or defensive motions. And so there's a gentle emotional valence to the behavior of these environments, sending out peristaltic ripples of gentle air trickling through the environment, such as you can see in these kind of responding motions after the initial sensations of being tracked by the arrays of microprocessors. This work then starts with individual intimate gestures of reaching out, and the environment gently touches back, sensing you by virtue of the arrays of sensors, and responding first of all with a sense of nurture, that is gently caressing, breathing, a quiet response, a very different kind of architectural response than we might expect in a robot hall where we push a button and expect something to do our bidding. Rather, there's a kind of a mutual relationship with this work that's sought, in which it is very much at our service as a sentient, caring architecture, but it also has its own agenda of trying to draw into itself its own fertility so that it can have its own self-renewing systems, so that it can grow and renew itself. And that's being worked on in practical ways in the latest series of this artificial metabolism, working with some wonderful protocell chemists. Protocells are a new kind of chemistry, synthetic biology, which tries to work with mineral interactions, echoing and generating some of the qualities that qualify as life itself. If you can think of the experience of an amoeba, for example, I mean, amoebas don't really drive themselves around by free will. They're as much pulled around by the external pressures as they are driven by their internal agendas. And that kind of exchange creates a very curious kind of mutual relationship with the architecture that might serve as a model for an architectural filter. Here you can see some of the glass flasks that are embedded throughout the system, and the self-generating skins making a kind of self-renewing skin for the geotextiles in detail that are the next generation of the Hylozoic ground project. Let me just sum up then by showing a couple of paintings that speak about the aspiration of this work as a kind of architecture. When Fra Angelico's studio painted this great veil around this figure, I think that it qualifies as a kind of extraordinarily sensitive architecture, as if it could be a second and third skin for our own bodies, mediating between the surrounding environment and serving as a kind of expanded physiology, a kind of sensitivity in which architecture serves as a continuum with our own experiences, rather than something which is just at our service and which just does our bidding. Please allow me to show this Christian image, not so much as an article of faith, but rather as an extraordinary kind of investigation. Grunewald, who painted this in 1525, was earnestly trying to depict the operation of light in an expanded spectrum, discovering precise energy gradients radiating around this body. And if you connect this to the image that I showed before of the thermal plume around the body, then perhaps this would qualify as a kind of a next generation design space for architecture, in which we can increasingly access these kind of dimensions in practical and material ways and create a sensitive architecture. So I hope that these thoughts and these explorations serve as a contribution to possibilities for future architecture.